Here's a similar chart for Asia. You see some countries have grown very well, are growing very quickly. By the way, all this data is available on the World Bank website. I think it's maybe not very easy to see all this here. I will also make this available through the NMTA. But you can go to the World Bank website. The data is there. If you're interested in particular corridors, you can find the information there. Much of this data is based on reports that we get from the central banks. So you will find that for some countries where the data capture for remittances is not very sophisticated, that the numbers may typically be much lower than what you would expect. And there's other sources for information that estimate remittances based on migrant numbers, which sometimes get to much higher numbers. As I represent the World Bank, I can't tell you what is wrong or what is right, but I think it's certainly worth looking at the estimates as well. Actually, Dr. Orozco has provided estimates for some countries. I think IFAD is also providing estimates for some of the countries. So there's other information that one can look at to understand what the flows look like. Here are the main markets in Asia. As you can see, the two really big ones are growing quickly again. India is growing very quickly. India also has had a huge price reduction because of the online remittance providers that you have there. It has helped to bring down the prices. And that may also be why you see so much growth, because these are formal flows, so flows through the regulated system. And typically, if you see a big jump in the growth of the volume, it's not just because there's more migration or people send more, sometimes also has to do that flows move from the informal sector to the formal sector. And typically, when the prices fall in the formal sector, you see that people who used to use the informal sector tend to switch to the formal sector, and I think that's what happened in India. Here's Latin America. I'm sure many of you can look at your own transaction numbers and they will know what happened in the different markets, but this is the data as we see it. As I said, I think the bounce back, unfortunately, in Latin America was less than it was in many other regions. And you can see here that some countries are still on a relatively depressed level, especially the larger markets, unfortunately. But the research team in the World Bank believes that will also change. But the migration pattern that Manuel pointed out earlier, I think, will have a big impact, as he rightly said. Migration to the US is changing. And with that, of course, remittances from the US will be changing. So we will monitor this very closely because we want to see if the growth trend that we used to have a few years back will continue, or if we see the much slower growth that we are seeing in the last 1.5 years. Oops, I think I jumped my Mexico. There you see the flow for Mexico. That's still on a relatively depressed level. I think the data there is very good. The central bank in Mexico has excellent remittance data, so I think this is very reliable and represents actual flows quite well. I have 5 minutes left. That's not much. So I'll jump through some of this so I can talk a little bit about the prices, because I know it's a contentious issue. The World Bank has something that's called the Remittance Prices Worldwide Database. And we survey remittance prices by sending researchers to remittance companies to pose as remitters in over 60 countries. So we have teams that go to all the main remittance send countries, go to many, many companies that offer remittance services, banks, post offices, MTOs, and so on. And they go to the individual branches or agents or to the online services, or they call the call centers and they pretend that they want to make a remittance, and they survey the prices, and everything is put into a big database. And we publish this data. And it's used by policymakers to both try to identify corridors that are very expensive so that policy initiatives can be directed at the corridors where there seem to be inefficiencies. Because, of course, as I said earlier, if the prices are high, there typically are inefficiencies in the market. So policymakers are interested to look at these peaks, at these outliers, as we call it, where prices seem to be higher than the region or higher than the global average. And they will then try to address this. I'll give you some some samples. The two main indices that we track is the global average cost, which is a straight average of all the remittance providers, all the corridors that we track, both for the G8 and the G20, who now have these commitments to reduce the global average costs. And then we have something that's called the International MTO Index. And that includes MTOs that are present in, I think, more than 80% of all global corridors. So it's not many. As you can see here, the MTO index is relatively high, and we'll see in a later chart that if you look at the prices of money transfer companies overall, they're actually below the global average. So that means that the smaller companies are often cheaper than the big ones, which policymakers have realized, and I think therefore they want to try and have more competition, more companies and smaller ones. Here are the prices in G8 countries. I think the most interesting development there is that in France and Germany and Japan, all countries that have recently reformed their legal framework, in Europe because of the Payment Services Directive, and in Japan with a similar regulation, the prices have gone up. In Germany and France, we've studied this case very intensively. It's mainly because fees have gone up. The large providers that are there, and there's very few at the moment, have increased their commissions. And we think that maybe a dead cat bounce, if you like. They're trying to make use of the market opportunity before it's over, because you see more and more payment institutions that are licensed in Europe now coming into the market and providing remittance services at lower costs. But of course, until this ultimately really has an impact on the market, we think there's some opportunistic behavior trying to make use of the existing market positions. These are the remittance costs by region, and as I said, sub-Saharan Africa is much, much more expensive than remittance prices in other regions. So much of the policy attention now is on sub-Saharan Africa, trying to address issues there, trying to open up the markets and trying to increase competition. These are costs from the US to different regions. I think MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, seems to be the most expensive one. When I was in the industry, I had very little experience in that region, but maybe there's an opportunity there for somebody to wants to expand to go into that region and capture higher margins than they could, for example, for Latin America. Here's, I think, an interesting piece of information: costs by different types of remittance service providers. So there's banks, money transfer companies, post office, and there's the global average. And you see that banks tend to be the most expensive ones. That is because they typically don't have a service that is tailored towards migrant remittances. They have international transfer systems which tend to be more corporate and more expensive. And money transfer companies, as you can see here, are cheaper. Specialized money transfer companies, how to say, are cheaper than the global average. That is the total of all money transfer companies that we have in our database. And the post offices, who have made an increasing effort to be in the international money transfer business, also provide very low costs, and I think the costs are probably coming down in the post offices as well. And I can maybe encourage the industry to, if you're trying to get into new markets, you're trying to find new payers in countries, look at the post offices. Many of them are now adopting a good system. Many of them are eager to pay remittances. The regulatory framework in most cases allows them to pay remittances. So there may be an interesting opportunity as a partner. Here's different costs by product type. Mobile services are amongst the cheapest. Online is also cheap. Surprisingly, account-to-account tends to be very expensive, even though you would think that should be most efficient because it's mainly electronic, but that's not the case, and I think that's because of what I just explained about the services systems that banks have in place. Cash-to-cash is, I think, still the predominant way of sending money, and if you consider the cost that operators have in cash-to-cash transactions, I think one has to recognize that the prices are probably reasonable overall, and we recognize this, policymakers recognize this, and wherever we go, take my word for it, we explain to policymakers that you can only reduce costs if you can increase the efficiencies. if you have to send, you have to receive cash and you have to pay out cash, you have high costs, you need brick and mortar infrastructure, and all this costs a lot of money. So there's a flaw of how low prices can be in that type of service. And we encourage, of course, other types of remittance technologies, online and mobile, because we think there's a greater opportunity for price reductions. But I think so far there's been a limited impact, maybe more on the online services. We've seen a fast growth and very low prices in online services. Whilst the mobile remittance services, I think, as generally we see it with mobile payments, there's a lot of talking, there's many new initiatives, but in terms of actual implementation, changes on the ground, there's still very few countries where this has really taken hold and has had a big impact on the market. However, we believe in the long run it will certainly be a game changer for this industry, maybe more than online services, but for the moment online services seem to have gained more ground than the mobile services. And I'm running out of time, so the most contagious issue I will only talk about very briefly, that's foreign exchange margins. In our price database, we measure both the fees but also the foreign exchange margins. And from our discussion with the industry, I know that the industry is not always happy about the way this is measured. Because what we do is we take what we, from our research, believe is the most widely used commercial foreign exchange rate and compare it with the retail rate that is given to the migrant that sends money. And from that, we calculate the margin. And the rate that we are using is typically the interbank rate, which many money transfer companies don't have access to because they're not banks. However, it is still the most commonly used and most widely quoted rate. And as we need to have reliable information to calculate this, this is what we're using. Where there's other information that is reliable and that we can get without having to research it ourselves, we use those. There's complaints about this from the NMTA, and I will be happy to discuss this offline. But you'll see here what the FX margins typically tend to be in a reasonable level now, other than in sub-Saharan Africa, where they tend to be extremely high. Also, you have more volatility. And generally, where you have more volatility, ultimately the margins end up being higher. But I think it's competitive, but for sub-Saharan Africa, where we see it's still relatively high margins. Here you see some of the largest send countries, the total cost, and then as a component of this, that is the actual foreign exchange margin. And very often, people come to us and say, well, you know, this thing with the prices, the money transfer companies, they tell you they charge 10 and then they have these huge foreign exchange margins. This is the information we give them because I think that's not necessarily true. There may be some opportunistic behaviors at times, but I think in general foreign exchange margins are not unreasonable. We appreciate that money transfer companies also need to cover a risk. And now under new regulation, you need to fix the payout amount, so to cover the fluctuations, of course, there needs to be some margin. So I think this is understood, and I don't think that's the main problem with the remittance prices. We think there's more in the legal framework than there is in these topics. And I think with this, I'll close. There's more slides. If anybody has need for more information and would like to discuss any of the issues, I'll be here until tomorrow noon. I'll be very happy to talk about it. And again, all the information is public on our remittance price database and in our migrant and remittance surveys. I encourage you to go to the World Bank website and get the information there if you need it. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.